At 7 a.m., in a small apartment in New York, an old officer fastens the collar of a white shirt and hears the crisp snick of the button. Rain taps the window. Coffee waits on the table. The suit is formal. The room is not. No guest is coming. No superior will inspect him. No crowd will measure the crease of his jacket. Still, his hand reaches for the silk necktie as if rank itself were waiting to be restored. That is where the mistake begins. The event is simple: a man dresses well to sit alone with coffee. But the impression arrives with force. It says the silence means something. It says the empty room has judged him. It says dignity requires witness. Epictetus would stop there. Not at the suit. At the assent. Because responsibility does not begin when the world answers. It begins when the mind decides what the silence means. That decision is smaller than pride, and more severe than pride. It is the private ruling made before the first sip of coffee, before the first step across the kitchen floor, before the hand finishes drawing the silk necktie through the knot. The man has not yet spoken. No one has insulted him. No one has denied him a place. The rain has not accused him. The apartment has not sentenced him. The silence is only silence. But the mind does not always leave an event alone. It reaches toward the silence and adds a verdict. It says, "This room proves you have been forgotten." It says, "This suit is foolish without an audience." It says, "A man who once had duty, command, and visible respect must now explain himself to an empty chair." That is not the event. That is judgment. The boundary of control begins with this separation. The retired officer does not govern the rain over New York. He does not govern who knocks, who remembers, who calls, who has moved on, who still speaks his name, or who has allowed his name to disappear. He does not govern the years behind it. He does not govern the fact that the room has not seen a guest in a long time. He does not govern whether the world treats his formal suit as dignity, habit, stubbornness, discipline, or loneliness. But he does govern the use of his own mind. He governs whether he treats the silence as evidence. He governs whether he lets the crisp snick of the collar button become an order. He governs whether the silk necktie becomes a demand for recognition or a simple object under his fingers. He governs whether he turns a rainy morning into a trial of his worth. This is where many people lose the first battle of the day. Not in the office. Not in traffic. Not when the inbox opens. Not when the phone stays quiet. They lose it at the point where an external thing appears, and the mind quietly grants it authority. A meeting gets cancelled, and the mind says, "They do not respect me." A message goes unanswered, and the mind says, "I have been dismissed." A family member speaks coldly, and the mind says, "I must answer with the same coldness." A bill arrives, and the mind says, "My whole life is now under threat." The event may be difficult. It may require action. It may require repair, patience, firmness, or sacrifice. Stoicism does not ask a person to pretend externals do not matter in practical life. Rain matters if the roof leaks. Money matters if rent is due. Reputation matters if a duty depends on trust. But none of these things has the right to seize the ruling faculty and command assent without examination. Epictetus is hard on this point because life is hard on this point. The world will keep presenting weather, delay, age, silence, public judgment, other people's choices, and the long consequences of past events. If a man hands his governing center to each of these, he will be ruled by whatever arrives next. So the officer stands in the apartment with the collar fastened. The suit jacket waits. The coffee cools slightly. Rain moves against the glass. The room remains quiet. Nothing in that room can decide whether he will act with dignity. Nothing in that room can decide whether he will meet the morning with order. Nothing in that room can decide whether he will give the day his attention or surrender it to an unexamined impression. His authority is narrower than he wants. It is also stronger than he thinks. It does not extend to guests, applause, old rank, public usefulness, or the past obeying his preference. It extends to judgment, assent, intention, attention, and the next response. That may sound small until you see that every honorable action begins there. Before a person can fulfill duty, he must stop lying about what belongs to him. Before he can carry responsibility, he must stop calling externals his master. The silence of the room is not his responsibility. What he makes of the silence is. The rain is not his responsibility. Whether he uses the rain as an excuse to decay in thought is. The fact that no one is coming to inspect the suit is not his responsibility. Whether he needs an inspector in order to sit upright is. The years are not his responsibility. The use of this morning is. So he adjusts the silk necktie, not to prove that he still matters, not to summon a witness, not to rebuild a vanished command, but to practice government where government actually exists. His fingers can move carefully. His breath can remain steady. His attention can return to the table, the cup, the chair, the next act. He can refuse to turn silence into an emperor. Responsibility begins when he stops demanding that the room change before he does what is his to do. Responsibility begins there because the first danger is not the empty apartment. It is the speed of the mind. The collar button gives its clean snick, and an impression arrives before any argument is made. That is how impressions work. They do not knock politely. They appear. They say, "Look at this. Notice this. React to this." The old officer hears the sound, feels the shirt tighten at his throat, sees the silk necktie lying across the back of the chair, and the whole morning seems to gather into one private accusation. But an impression is not yet a command. That point matters. The first appearance may be sharp. It may feel urgent. It may come with the weight of old rank, old rooms, old voices, old routines that once told him where to stand and what mattered. It may tell him that putting on a formal suit to drink coffee alone is not merely strange, but humiliating. Still, the impression is only the first knock at the door of the mind. The judgment comes next. The judgment says, "This silence proves something about you." The judgment says, "A room without guests means your dignity has no witness." The judgment says, "The suit has lost its meaning because no one is there to read it." The judgment takes a fact and adds authority to it. The fact is simple: no guest is in the room. The false authority is added when the mind says, "Therefore your worth is reduced." Epictetus would make the man stop at that exact step. Not because the silence is pleasant. Not because aging is easy. Not because a life of duty can be folded away without cost. But because the mind has committed a serious error. It has treated an external condition as if it were qualified to judge the ruling faculty. That is the value error. The room is being valued above choice. Witness is being valued above conduct. The memory of public standing is being valued above present discipline. The external has been inflated until it seems larger than the power to examine, refuse, and choose. Then comes assent. Assent is the inward yes. It is not always spoken. It may be a small tightening in the face. It may be the hand pausing too long over the silk necktie. It may be the private sentence, "What is the point?" It may be the decision to leave the tie hanging, not from freedom, but from surrender. It may be the slow movement toward the chair as if the morning has already been decided by the empty room. That is the trap. The trap is not wearing the suit. The trap is not drinking coffee alone. The trap is not remembering that the apartment has not seen a guest in years. The trap is ascending too quickly to the impression, allowing the silence to decide the next movement before the judgment has been examined. The mind says, "This is proof." The trained faculty answers, "Proof of what?" That question interrupts slavery. It does not erase the rain. It does not fill the apartment with voices. It does not make the past return. But it stops the false transfer of authority. It refuses to let silence become law. Now the sequence is visible. Event: a retired officer dresses formally at 7 a.m. in a small New York apartment while rain hits the window. Impression: this scene feels urgent, personal, and threatening because the crisp snick of the collar button presses the mind to react. Judgment: the silence means I have lost standing, and the suit is meaningless without witness. Assent: I agree with that judgment before testing it, and I let it govern my posture, my attention, and my next action. Action: I either abandon the morning to the judgment, or I return to what is mine to govern. This is why Epictetus is useful at the kitchen table, not only in books. He forces the break in the chain. He does not say, "Control the rain." He does not say, "Control reputation." He does not say, "Control whether anyone remembers your service, visits your room, respects your history, or understands why you still tie the tie." He says, "Examine the impression." The officer can lift the silk necktie and let it become a test. Not a costume. Not a plea for recognition. A test. Can he touch this object without demanding that it restore his former place? Can he tighten the knot without turning it into a complaint? Can he sit with coffee in a quiet room and refuse to call silence an insult? That is where assent is trained. In the small pause before the mind says yes to the wrong master. He names the impression: this feels like loss of worth. He names the judgment: I am treating an empty room as proof against my dignity. He names the boundary: the room is not mine to command, my assent is. Then the next action becomes clean. Button the jacket. Pick up the cup. Sit upright. Drink the coffee. Let the rain fall. Let the room remain quiet. Do not ask the silence for permission to act with order. Ascesis begins at the point where the officer no longer argues with the room. Not because the room has become easier. Not because the rain has stopped. Not because some visitor has suddenly crossed the hallway and knocked. Nothing external has improved. The apartment is still small. The morning is still wet. The coffee is still waiting on the table. The silence still carries the weight of years without company. That is why it is training. Training is not a speech made after life becomes favorable. Training is what happens while the condition remains unchanged and the ruling faculty is asked to stand in its proper place. For Epictetus, the work is not to decorate the mind with noble ideas. The work is to meet the impression while it is still fresh, while it still has force, while it is still trying to pass itself off as truth. So the first movement is physical and exact. He stops his hand. That is the beginning. The hand is halfway toward the silk necktie, and he refuses to move automatically. He does not dramatize the pause. He does not make a ceremony out of it. He simply notices that the body was about to obey a judgment the mind had not inspected. That small stop matters. A man who cannot stop for one breath will call many things fate that are only habit. Then he names the impression. This feels like the room is judging me. That sentence does not have to be spoken out loud. It only has to be clear. The impression is no longer hidden inside the atmosphere of the apartment. It has been brought into view. The crisp snick of the collar button produced pressure. The silence gave that pressure a shape. The mind tried to turn that shape into a command. Naming it weakens the false authority. The next movement is to separate the event from the meaning. He lets the event stand bare. Rain at 7 a.m. A formal suit. Coffee on the table. A silk necktie in the hand. No guest in the room. No appointment requiring the jacket. No public office waiting for him. These are facts. They may be uncomfortable facts. They may be plain facts. But they are not verdicts. The verdict was added. This is where the training becomes sharper. He must not flatter himself by calling the judgment discipline. He must not say, I am only being realistic, when what he means is, I have agreed that witness is necessary for dignity. Realism reports the room. Judgment assigns worth to it. Realism says no one is here. Judgment says therefore I am less. The officer returns attention to the silk necktie. Not as a symbol of former command. Not as proof that he still deserves public recognition. He holds it as an object. Smooth fabric. Weight in the fingers. A narrow strip of order that requires care. The tie does not praise him. It does not pity him. It does not restore his past. It only gives attention something definite to govern. He folds it under the collar. That is another micro-action. The mind wants to roam into years, names, promotions, missed calls, funerals, closed doors, and rooms where he used to be expected. But the hand has work. The fold must be placed. The length must be judged. The knot must be drawn without hurry. This is not vanity. It is the refusal to abandon the present task because the past has become loud. Then he tests the judgment directly. Does the empty room prevent right conduct? The answer is no. It may expose the desire for witness. It may reveal how much the mind has leaned on being seen. It may show that public role had been mistaken for inner rule. But it does not prevent right conduct. It does not prevent him from sitting straight. It does not prevent him from drinking coffee without complaint. It does not prevent him from keeping the morning orderly. It does not prevent attention, assent, intention, or the next response. So he adjusts the knot once. Not 5 times. Not anxiously. Once, with care. Excess correction would be another form of slavery, another attempt to make the external carry more meaning than it should. The point is not to perfect the tie until the room approves. The point is to act according to a standard that does not require the room to answer. Then he walks to the table. Each step is ordinary. That is why it counts. Philosophy that cannot survive the walk from the bedroom mirror to the kitchen table is not yet philosophy. The officer hears the rain, sees the chair, smells the coffee, and the silence tries again. It says the scene is empty. It says the act is unnecessary. It says discipline without audience is foolish. He answers by sitting down. No argument. Conduct. He places both feet on the floor. He takes the cup by the handle. He lets the heat of it register in the hand. He does not use the coffee to hide from the morning. He uses the morning to practice accuracy. Event here. Impression here. Judgment here. Assent here. Next action here. That sequence is ascesis. Not punishment. Not self-display. not a harsh performance for an imaginary audience. Ascesis is the repeated return of authority to the part of the person that can actually choose. It is small because the first choices are small. It is serious because the first choices teach the later ones. If he can refuse false assent in this room, he is less likely to sell it later in a harder room. If he can sit with silence without calling it disgrace, he is less likely to treat public opinion as law. If he can wear the suit without needing the suit to restore his identity, he is closer to freedom than the man who is applauded but governed by applause. The practice is simple, but not soft. Pause before assent. Name the impression. Separate the event from the judgment. Return to the silk necktie. Choose the next governable action. Repeat when the silence returns. Because it will return. And when it does, the task is not to defeat silence. The task is to stop making silence responsible for the condition of the ruling faculty. Responsibility, then, is not a mood that arrives when the room feels honorable. It is not the return of a visitor, the sound of a phone, the confirmation that someone still remembers what he did, who he was, or what rank once stood beside his name. Responsibility cannot wait for the apartment to feel less empty. If it waits for that, it has already been handed over to the room. The officer sits at the table in the formal suit. The silk necktie rests clean against the shirt. The coffee is in front of him. Rain continues against the window. Nothing about the external scene has been repaired. That is the point. Conduct is tested while the external remains stubborn. A man can behave with order when the room applauds him. That proves little. A man can stand straight when a uniform, a title, or a public duty tells him where to place his hands. That may be useful, but it is not yet freedom. The stronger question is whether he can keep the same inward standard when no one is present to reward the standard. This is where duty changes shape. Earlier in life, duty may have come with schedules, inspections, orders, offices, calls, signatures, and consequences visible to other people. There were rooms where his absence would be noticed. There were mistakes that others would correct. There were names attached to responsibilities, and those names gave structure to the day. Now the structure is quieter. But quiet does not cancel duty. It only removes the audience. The duty before him is not theatrical. He is not required to invent grand meaning out of a cup of coffee. He is not required to pretend that years of silence have no weight. He is required to govern what is governable. That means he must not allow the empty room to make his conduct careless. He must not allow the absence of witness to make him false. He must not allow an unexamined judgment to decide that dignity is no longer worth practicing. This is not vanity. Vanity needs eyes. Responsibility does not. Vanity asks, how do I appear? Responsibility asks, what is mine to do now? In this small apartment at 7 a.m., what is his to do is limited and exact. He can sit upright. He can drink without resentment. He can keep the room in order. He can answer the morning without complaint. He can notice the thought that says, none of this matters, and refuse to grant it command. He can let the suit be part of discipline, not a petition for recognition. The silk necktie is useful here because it cannot flatter him. It does not say he is still important. It does not say he has been forgotten. It is only fabric held in place by a knot he chose to make. If he asks it to restore his public worth, he has misused it. If he lets it gather his attention back into the present act, he has used it correctly. Responsibility works the same way in other rooms. A person at an office desk wants the meeting to prove his value. A parent at a kitchen table wants gratitude before continuing the hard conversation. A worker in a parking lot wants respect before doing the next necessary thing. A son or daughter in a hospital hallway wants certainty before acting with patience. The external condition may be serious. But the false demand is the same: let the world first give me the right feeling, and then I will conduct myself well. Epictetus cuts through that bargain. Right conduct does not depend on the world becoming obedient. It depends on the ruling faculty refusing to become disordered by what is not its own. The outcome is not yours. Other minds are not yours. Timing is not yours. Reputation is not yours. The past is not yours to revise. But intention is yours. Judgment is yours. Assent is yours. The next response is yours. That is enough responsibility to carry. Not the whole weather of the morning. Not every closed door. Not every silence. Not every forgotten service. Only the use of this present faculty. So the officer does not owe the room a performance. He owes himself accurate judgment. He owes the day his attention. He owes the present moment a clean response. If there are bills on the table, he can open them without calling them a verdict on his life. If there is no message on the phone, he can leave it where it is without turning the absence into insult. If there is a dish in the sink, a jacket to hang, a floor to sweep, a letter to answer, he can do the next thing because the next thing is where character becomes visible to itself. Responsibility is not self-blame. That must be clear. The officer is not responsible for aging, for rain, for other people's neglect, for the long silence of the apartment, or for the fact that formal clothes no longer carry the same public function they once carried. To make him responsible for all of that would be another error, another way of confusing what is his with what is not. He is responsible for the assent he gives. He is responsible for whether he lets the shadow of the room decide his conduct. He is responsible for whether he treats the absence of an audience as permission to abandon the standard. And if he keeps the standard in private, then the standard is real. Not impressive. Real. He lifts the cup. He drinks the coffee. He lets the silence remain a condition, not a ruler. The rain continues. The room does not change. But his conduct has returned to its proper authority. Freedom, in this room, is not the power to make silence disappear. It is the power to stop obeying it. The officer has not been released from age, weather, memory, or the long absence of guests. The rain still presses against the window. The coffee still sits in a room no one else has entered. The formal suit still carries a history the morning does not recognize. But the silk necktie no longer has to argue for his worth. It has become what it should be, an object held by attention, used with care, then left in its place. That is a quieter freedom than most people want. It does not announce itself. It does not require applause. It does not need the old rank, the full room, the approving face, or the perfect condition. It begins when assent is no longer sold to the first impression that arrives. A person becomes less governable by externals when he stops asking externals to certify his dignity. The room may remain silent. Let it. The past may remain past. Let it. Other minds may remember or forget. Let them. The work is not to bend these things back into obedience. The work is to meet the morning with a judgment that has been examined, an intention that has been chosen, and a next action that belongs to you. So he finishes the coffee. He stands. He straightens the jacket once. Not for witness. For order. Return to what is yours to govern.